Chapter 1. The Early Years. The Morell family lived in the village of Bestwood, in a house built by the mining company for its employees. Gertrude Morell was 31 years old and had been married for 8 years. Her husband, Walter, was a coal miner. There were 2 children, William, a boy of 7, and Annie, who was only 5. Mrs. Morell was expecting her 3rd baby in 2 months' time. They could not afford to have this 3rd. She did not want it. Its father spent most of his free time drinking in the pub. She had no respect for him, but she was tied to him. She was sick of it, this struggle with poverty and ugliness and dirt. Gertrude Morell was from a Nottingham family, educated, church-going people. Her father was an unsuccessful engineer. She had her mother's small, well-made figure and her father's clear blue eyes. When she was 23 years old, she met at a Christmas party a young man of 27. Walter had shining, black, wavy hair and a black beard. He laughed often and heartily, with a rich, ringing laugh. He was quick in his movements, an excellent dancer. He was so open and pleasant with everybody. Gertrude, who was not pleasure-loving like Walter, had never met anyone like him. His body burned with a soft golden flame, the flame of life, and seemed to her something wonderful. Walter Morell was equally impressed by Gertrude, her blue eyes, her soft brown curls, her beautiful smile. She spoke in an educated way. She had the manners of a lady. The next Christmas they were married, and for 3 months she was perfectly happy. She admired him for being a miner, risking his life daily. Sometimes, when she herself was tired of love talk, she tried to open her heart seriously to him. He listened to her respectfully, but without understanding. She realized that she could not share her deeper thoughts and ideas with him. Instead, he took pleasure in making and mending, doing little jobs around the house. Her first big shock was when she found that the bills for their new furniture were not yet paid, and that he did not own their house as he had told her, but was paying rent, and too high a rent, for it. Then, he began to be rather late coming home. "They're working very late these days, aren't they?" she said to a neighbour. "No later than they always do," she answered. "But they stop to have a drink at the pub, and then they get talking. Dinner's stone cold, and it's just what they deserve." "But Mr. Morell doesn't drink." The woman looked hard at Mrs. Morell, then went on with her work, saying nothing. Mrs. Morell was very ill when the first boy was born. Morell was good to her, but she felt very lonely, miles away from her own people. When her husband was with her, it made the loneliness worse. The child was small and weak at first, but he quickly grew strong. He was a beautiful baby, with dark golden curls and dark blue eyes, which gradually changed to a clear grey. He came just when her disappointment was at its greatest, and her life seemed most empty. She gave all her attention to her child, and the father was jealous. While the baby was still small, it often annoyed Morell, and sometimes he hit it. Then, Mrs. Morell hated her husband for days. Feeling unloved, Morell went out and drank. On his return, she greeted him with fierce, stinging remarks about his drinking. Morell always rose early, about 5 or 6, even on a holiday. On Sunday morning, he usually got up and prepared breakfast. The child rose with his father, while the mother lay resting for another hour or so. William was now 1 year old, and his mother was proud of him. He was so pretty. One Sunday morning, Mrs. Morell lay listening to the two of them talking below. Then she fell asleep. When she came downstairs, there was a big fire burning, and breakfast was laid. Morell sat in his armchair, looking rather shamefaced. The child stood between his legs, his head of hair cut short like a sheep, and on a newspaper spread out in front of the fire lay William's golden curls, shining in the firelight. Mrs. Morell stood quite still and went very white. "So, what do you think of him?" laughed Morell, a little guiltily. She came forward ready to hit him. "I could kill you, I could," she said, so angry she could hardly speak. She picked up the child, buried her face in his shoulder, and cried painfully. Morell sat looking at the fire in shock. Later, she said she had been silly. The boy's hair had to be cut sooner or later. But she remembered this event for the rest of her life. Before, she had wanted to bring her husband closer to her. From now on, he was an outsider. This made her life easier to accept. The pity was, she was too much his opposite. In trying to make him better than he was, she destroyed him. The Morells were poor. Morell was expected to give his wife 30 shillings a week to pay for everything: rent, food, clothes, insurance, doctors. Sometimes it was a little more often less. On Friday night, and Saturday and Sunday, Morell spent freely, mostly on beer. He rarely gave William an extra penny or a pound of apples. One public holiday, he decided to walk to Nottingham with Jerry Purdy, one of his drinking companions. They spent most of the day visiting pubs. Mrs. Morell had stayed at home all day, working in the house. In the evening, Morell returned, kicking open the garden gate and breaking the lock. He entered the kitchen unsteadily and nearly upset a bowl of boiling liquid, which was cooling on the table. "God help us, coming home in his drunkenness," cried Mrs. Morell. "Coming home in his what?" shouted her husband, his hat over one eye. "Say you're not drunk," she insisted. "Only a nasty old cat like you could have such a thought," answered Morell. "You've been drinking all day, so if you're not drunk by 11 o'clock at night," she replied, "we know well enough what you do when you go out with your beautiful Jerry. There's money to drink with, if there's money for nothing else. I've not spent 2 shillings all day," he said. "Well, if Jerry's been buying your drinks, tell him to spend his money on his children. They need it. And what about your own children? You can't afford to keep them, can you?" "What's it got to do with you?" he shouted. "Got to do with me? Why, a lot. You give me just 25 shillings to do everything with. You go off drinking all day, come rolling home at midnight. It's a lie. It's a lie. Shut your face, woman." The quarrel got fiercer and fiercer. Each forgot everything except their hatred of the other. She was just as angry as he. "You're a liar," he shouted, banging on the table with his hand. "You're a liar! You're a liar!" All the dislike she felt for him now came pouring out. "You're nothing but dirt in this house," she cried. "Then get out of it. It's mine. It's me who brings the money home, not you. So get out. Get out!" "And I would," she cried in tears at her own powerlessness. "I would have gone long ago, but for those children. Do you think I stay for you?" He came up to her and held her arms tightly. She cried out struggling to be free. He took her roughly to the outside door and pushed her out of the house, banging the door shut and locking it behind her. Then he sank exhausted into a chair and soon lost consciousness. She stood for a few moments, staring helplessly in the August night, her body shaking, remembering the unborn child inside her. The darkness was full of the sweet smell of flowers. There was no noise anywhere. Then a train rushed across the valley miles away. She went to the back door and tried the handle. It was still locked. Through the window, she could just see her husband's head on the table and his arms spread out. She knocked on the window more and more loudly, but still he did not wake. Fearful for the unborn child, she walked up and down the garden path to keep warm, knocking every now and then on the window, telling herself that in the end he must wake. At last, he heard the knocking and woke up. "Open the door, Walter," she said coldly. Realizing what he had done, he hurried to unlock the door. As Mrs. Morell entered, she saw him disappearing shamefacedly up the stairs. When at last she herself went to bed, Morell was already asleep. Chapter 2. The Birth of Paul. Before the baby was born, Mrs. Morell cleaned the house from top to bottom. When Morell got home one evening, the child had already arrived. The delivery nurse met him in the kitchen. "Your wife is in a bad way. It's a boy child." He hung up his coat and then dropped into his chair. "Have you got a drink?" he asked. The nurse brought him one, then without a word served him his dinner and went back upstairs. He ate his meal, sat for 20 minutes, made up the fire, and then unwillingly went up to the bedroom. His face was still black and sweaty as he stood at the end of the bed. "Well, how are you then?" he asked. "I shall be all right," she answered. It's a boy." She turned down the blanket and showed him the baby. He pretended to be pleased, but she knew he was not much interested. He wanted to kiss her, but he did not dare, so he left the room. Mrs. Morell sat looking at her baby, and the baby looked up at her. It had blue eyes, like her own, which seemed to bring out her most secret thoughts. She no longer loved her husband. She had not wanted this child, and there it lay in her arms and pulled at her heart. A wave of hot love went out of her towards the child. She held it close to her face and breast. It had come into the world unloved. She would love it all the more, now it was here. During these months, Morell got angry at the slightest thing. He seemed exhausted by his work. He complained if the fire was low or his dinner was not to his liking. If the children made a noise, he shouted at them in a way that made their mother's blood boil. They hated him and his bad temper. "Goodness me, man, there isn't a bit of peace while you're in the house," said Mrs. Morell at last. "I know that. You're never happy till I'm out of your sight," he answered, and hurried to escape. He was still not home by 11 o'clock. Finally, she heard him coming. He had taken his revenge. He was drunk. "Is there nothing to eat in the house?" he asked roughly. "You know what there is," she said coldly. He leaned unsteadily on the table and pulled at the table drawer to get a knife to cut bread. The drawer stuck, so he pulled harder. It flew right out, and spoons, forks, knives fell all over the floor. The baby woke at the noise. "What are you doing, you drunken fool?" the mother cried. In trying to fit the drawer back in, it fell, hurting his leg. In his anger, he picked it up and threw it at his wife. One of the corners hit her above the eye. Blood ran into her eye, and red drops fell on the baby's blanket. "Did it hit you?" asked Morel, bending over her unsteadily. "Go away." "Let me look at it, woman." She smelled the drink on his breath and weakly pushed him away. He stood, staring at her. "What has it done to you, dear?" he asked. "You can see what it's done," she answered. Mrs. Morel would not let him touch her. She cleaned the wound herself and went upstairs, telling him to mend the fire and lock the door. It was her own fault, he told himself afterwards. Having hurt her, he hated her. By the following Wednesday, he had no money left. He looked inside his wife's purse when she was in the garden with the baby, and took a sixpence. The next day, Mrs. Morel found the money missing, and was sure he had taken it. When he had had his dinner, she said to him coldly, "Did you take sixpence from my purse last night?" Although he denied it, she knew he was lying. "So you steal sixpence from my purse while I'm bringing the washing in," she said accusingly. "I'll make you pay for this," answered Morel. He got washed and went upstairs with a determined expression on his face. Soon afterwards he came down dressed, with his things tied up in an enormous blue handkerchief. "You'll see me again when you do," he said. "It'll be before I want to," his wife replied. At that, he marched out of the house with his parcel. William and Annie were surprised to find their father gone. "Where's he going to?" asked William. "I don't know," said his mother. "He's taken his things wrapped up in a handkerchief, and he says he's not coming back." "What shall we do?" cried the boy in alarm. "Don't worry. He won't go far." "But if he doesn't come back," said Annie fearfully. She and William sat on the sofa and burst into tears. When Mrs. Morel went to fetch coal from the coal house at the end of the garden, she felt something hidden behind the door. There, in the dark, was the big blue parcel. She laughed and went back to the house. William and Annie were crying again because she had left them. "Silly babies," she said. "Go down to the coal house and look behind the door, and then you'll see how far he's gone." Off they went to look. No longer worried, they went contentedly to bed. Mrs. Morel sat waiting. She was tired of him. Tired to death. He had not even had the courage to take his things further than the bottom of the garden. At about 9 o'clock, he came in, looking guilty. She said nothing. He took off his coat and sat down to take off his boots. "You better fetch your things from the coal house before you take your boots off," she said quietly. "You can thank your stars I've come back tonight," he said, trying to impress her. He looked such a fool she was not even angry with him. But her heart was bitter, because he had once been the man she loved. Chapter 3. William takes the lead. Some time later, Morel became seriously ill. His wife nursed him, and being strong, he soon recovered. He depended on her almost like a child, and she was more tolerant of him now, because she loved him less. Instead, she turned for love and life to the children, and he half accepted this, letting them take his place in her heart. When they sat together at night, He was restless, feeling a sort of emptiness. Then he went off to bed, and she settled down to enjoy herself alone, working, thinking, living. The baby Paul hated to be touched by him. Usually a quiet baby, he went stiff in his father's arms and immediately started to scream. He was a pale, rather silent child, and his face often wore a worried or puzzled expression. Now, another baby was coming, the fruit of this time of peace between the parents. This new baby was again a boy, and they called him Arthur. He was very pretty, with a head of golden curls, and he loved his father from the first. Hearing his father's footsteps, he used to wave his arms and laugh. At the same time, William grew bigger and stronger and more active, while Paul, always rather slight, got thinner and followed his mother around like a shadow. When William was 13, his mother got him a job in the Cooperative Society office. His father wanted him to become a miner, like himself. "He's not going down the mine," said Mrs. Morell, "and there's an end of it. If your mother put you in the mine at 12, it's no reason why I should do the same with my boy." She was very proud of her son. He was a clever boy, with an open nature, and eyes of the clearest grey. He went to night school and trained as a clerk. Then he became a teacher at the night school. He could run like the wind. When he was 12, he won first prize in a race. He could jump higher and throw farther than any boy in Bestwood. William began to get ambitious. He gave all his money to his mother. He went about with the sons of shopkeepers and the school teacher. He enjoyed all the social and sporting life that Bestwood offered. He also liked dancing, in spite of his mother. He was a great favourite with the ladies, and enjoyed telling Paul about his successes. About this time he began to study. With a friend of his, he started to learn French and Latin and other things. He and Fred Simpson studied together till midnight, sometimes till 1 o'clock. Soon he grew pale, and Mrs. Morell, alarmed, begged him to take better care of his health. When William was 19, he suddenly left the cooperative office and got a job in Nottingham. Now he had 30 shillings a week instead of 18. His mother and father were proud of him. It seemed that he was going to succeed in life. William stayed at his job in Nottingham for a year. He was studying hard, but he still went to all the dances and parties. Then he was offered a position in London at £120 a year. "They want me in Lime Street on Monday week, Mother," he cried, his eyes shining as he read the letter. Mrs. Morell felt everything go silent inside her. "Didn't I tell you I could do it? Think of me in London! And I can give you £20 a year, Mother. We shall all be rolling in money." "We shall, my son," she answered sadly. As the day of his departure came closer, she felt increasingly desperate. She loved him so much, and now he was going away. She felt that he was going out of her heart, leaving her only pain and sadness. Before he left, he was just 20. William burned his file of love letters from his lady friends. Then he went off to London to start a new file.